The auction wrapped up in under 4 hours. 180 Holstein dairy cows loaded into trailers and driven out of the valley. The barn went quiet for the first time in 43 years. No smell of hay and manure, no grinding of the milking equipment at 4:30 in the morning, no sound at all, just empty stalls and the faint echo of a decision that looked, on paper, like the smartest thing Dale Hoffner had ever done. It was not the smartest thing he'd ever done, and it would take him 3 years to fully understand why. This is the story of a farm that didn't fail because of bad luck or a bad market or a dishonest banker. It failed because of a cash flow problem that disguised itself as a debt problem, and by the time Dale saw the difference, the barn was empty, the cows were gone, and the money was already spent. Let me take you back to 2009. Dale Hoffner was the third generation to run Hoffner Dairy, a 420-acre operation in the hill country of western Wisconsin. His grandfather had started it in the late 1940s. His father had expanded it twice. Dale had taken over in 1998, and for the first decade, things were workable. Tight, but workable. The farm ran about 180 milking cows, producing somewhere around 12,000 pounds of milk per day. Checks came in every 2 weeks from the co-op. Not big checks, but regular ones, predictable ones. Then 2009 hit. Milk prices collapsed. The farm lost money for 18 straight months. When the markets recovered slightly in 2011, Dale had accumulated $1, $2 million in operating debt across 3 lines of credit. Interest alone was running $60,000 to $800 a month. Feed costs, labor, equipment maintenance, land taxes. When you added it all up, the dairy operation was burning through cash faster than the milk checks could replace it. That's when his lender had a conversation with him that felt, at the time, like a lifeline. "Your land is your asset," the agricultural loan officer told him. "The cows are your liability. If you sell the herd, you eliminate the variable costs, reduce the debt load, and give yourself breathing room to farm the crop acres profitably." Dale went home and ran the numbers. On paper, the math looked convincing. Sale of 180 cows at roughly $1,800 per head, $324,000. Combined with liquidating the milking equipment and related inventory, he could clear almost $380,000. That would cut his debt from $1, $2 million to roughly $820,000. Monthly interest drops from $6,800 to around $4,100. That's $2,700 a month in savings. Per year, $32,400. It looked like a rescue plan. It looked rational. It looked like someone finally thinking clearly in a crisis. What the numbers didn't show, what the spreadsheet couldn't capture, was what happened when the milk checks stopped coming. The sale took place in the spring of 2012. Dale had arranged the sale through a livestock broker and sold the entire herd in one transaction to a dairy operation 2 counties north. The buyer was a man named Tom Vickers, who ran a 600-cow operation and had been looking to expand. He paid fair market value, took delivery within a week, and the whole thing was done before the end of April. Dale Hoffner walked away from that transaction feeling, for the first time in 3 years, like he wasn't drowning. The first week after the sale, he did something he hadn't done in years. He slept past 5 a.m., no cows to milk, no feed to distribute, no equipment to check. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked out at 420 acres of land that he was going to farm with corn, soybeans, and some winter wheat. Clean, simple, less labor, lower risk. That feeling lasted about 6 weeks, because here's what the debt math hadn't accounted for. Dairy cows generate revenue every single week, not every month, not at harvest, every week. When you run 180 cows producing 12,000 pounds of milk a day, you get a co-op check roughly every 14 days. Even in a bad milk price year, that's $18,000 to $22,000 flowing in every 2 weeks. It's not profit, It's revenue, and it has to cover costs. But the key word is flowing. Constant, predictable, rolling in like a tide. Crop farming doesn't work that way. You plant in the spring, you harvest in the fall, and everything in between. Seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, equipment repairs, land taxes, insurance premiums, operating loan interest. All of it comes due on a schedule that doesn't wait for September. The first sign of trouble came in July. Dale had planted 280 acres of corn and 140 acres of soybeans that spring, standard for the region. He had an operating loan in place to cover input costs, about $190,000 for seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. His lender had approved it. His crop insurance was paid up. Everything was in order. Then his equipment insurance bill came in, $3,200. It was due in 30 days. He went to check his account. He had $100. He called his lender and asked to tap the operating line a little early to cover the insurance. The lender was cautious. "Dale, you're already at the ceiling on that line. We approved it for inputs. Insurance wasn't in the projection." They worked it out eventually. The lender made a small accommodation, but that conversation was the first signal Dale almost missed. He wasn't broke. He had 420 acres of crops in the ground growing. He had $820,000 in debt, yes, but also $820,000 worth of land and equipment as collateral. On paper, Hoffner Farm had positive net worth. On paper, everything was fine. But cash doesn't wait for paper. Cash needs to be in the account when the bill arrives. And from May to October, a crop farm is almost entirely cash out. You spend the whole growing season paying for a harvest that hasn't happened yet. Dairy had always provided the bridge, that steady river of milk revenue that kept the operating account above zero throughout the summer. Without it, Dale was crossing a 6-month cash desert with a limited supply of water. He made it through July. He made it through August. He borrowed against the operating line twice more to cover expenses the crop budget hadn't accounted for. A bearing went out on his planter, $1,400 repair. Fuel costs ran higher than projected. A land lease payment on rented acres came due a month earlier than he remembered. He made it to harvest, barely. October 2012, the corn yielded 168 bushels per acre. Soybeans came in at 47. Both were respectable. Both were close to county average. Dale sold at harvest prices. Corn at $6.90 per bushel, beans at $14.20. When all the grain was sold and all the bills were paid, he cleared approximately $310,000 in gross crop revenue. Subtract the operating loan repayment, input costs, land taxes, insurance, equipment costs, and his annual mortgage obligation, and he netted a little over $48,000. After 3 years of losses in the dairy, it felt like a victory. His lender called it stabilization. His wife called it finally. Dale called it proof that the decision to sell the herd had been the right one. Then 2013 arrived. The corn market broke hard in the summer of 2013. The USDA projected a record crop nationally. Corn futures dropped from above $7 to below $4, $50 by August. Soybeans held better, but not well enough to offset the corn collapse. Dale had locked in a portion of his corn sales early, about a third, but the rest he'd intended to sell at harvest, expecting prices to stay elevated. They didn't. When harvest was done in 2013, Dale's gross crop revenue came in at $198,000. That was $112,000 less than the previous year, on the same number of acres, with similar yields. The cost structure hadn't changed. The land taxes were the same. The equipment payments were the same. The operating loan was the same. He netted $11,000 for the year. $11,000 on 420 acres. That's less than $26 per acre. His daughter had a car payment larger than his annual income from the farm that year. This is where most farm stories would bring in the villain, the predatory banker, the corrupt co-op, the neighbor who underbid him at a critical moment. But none of that happened at Hoffner Farm. What happened was simple and impersonal and devastating. The crop market moved. That's it. No conspiracy, no bad actors. The market moved, and Dale had bet everything on a single income stream with no hedge, no backup, and no buffer. That's when the real problem started. Because here's the thing about dairy that Dale had lived inside for so long, he'd stopped seeing it clearly. Dairy cows are a diversification tool, not just a business, a structural hedge. When corn prices drop, milk prices don't necessarily drop with them. In fact, lower feed costs can improve dairy margins. When drought cuts crop yields, dairy can hold steady. When crop markets are oversupplied and prices collapse, dairy keeps generating that bi-weekly check. The two income streams don't move in perfect correlation. That's not an accident. That's the whole point. Dale's grandfather hadn't run both crops and cows because he didn't know any better. He'd run both because one covered for the other when markets turned. Dale had traded that structure for short-term debt relief. And now, with 2 consecutive years of crop dependence behind him, one decent, one disastrous, he was beginning to understand the full weight of that trade. He called Tom Vickers, the man who had bought his 180 cows 2 years before. "How's the herd doing?" Dale asked. "Good," Tom said. "Real good. Had a rough spring with milk prices, but the crop income helped cover it. Had a rough crop year, but the milk checks covered that. All in all, came out okay." Dale was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's good to hear." He hung up, sat with that for a long time. Tom Vickers had survived 2013 because he had 2 income streams that partially offset each other. He'd bought those 180 cows and folded them into an operation that already had crop acres. He was more diversified after the purchase than before. Dale, who had sold the cows to reduce risk, had actually concentrated it. In 2014, Dale had a harder conversation with his lender than any he'd had during the dairy crisis. His debt was $820,000. His net farm income over the previous 2 years had averaged less than $30,000. At that rate, he was not reducing debt. He was barely servicing it. And he was doing so while drawing down equipment reserves, deferred maintenance, aging combines, a grain dryer that needed a major overhaul he kept pushing to the following year. The lender's assessment was direct. The operation was technically solvent, but practically fragile. One more below-average crop year or one significant equipment failure could tip it into default territory. "What would it take to get back to dairy?" Dale asked. The lender ran the numbers. Restocking 180 cows at current market prices, roughly $2,000 per head, $360,000 total. Rebuilding the milking parlor, which had been partially stripped and converted to storage, another $80,000 to $120,000. Operating capital to carry the herd through the first year before revenues stabilized, another $150,000. Total re-entry cost, somewhere between $590,000 and $630,000. Dale had eliminated $380,000 in debt by selling the cows. Restoring the operation would cost $600,000. He'd moved backward by $220,000. And that was before accounting for the 2 years of reduced income he'd earned in the interim. He did not restock. He couldn't. What followed wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to watch. The farm shrank. In 2015, Dale sold 80 acres of the least productive ground to a neighbor for $3,400 per acre. That generated $272,000, which he applied to debt. His balance dropped to roughly $548,000, but he was now farming 340 acres instead of 420. Gross revenue potential was lower. The math didn't improve, it just changed shape. In 2016, the grain dryer finally failed beyond reasonable repair. Rather than replace it, Dale contracted his drying out to a local elevator, which cost him more per bushel but avoided a $65,000 capital expenditure he couldn't finance. Another small step backward dressed up as pragmatism. By 2017, the operation had stabilized in the way a slow leak stabilizes, not fixed, just slower. Dale was making his debt payments. He was covering input costs. He was farming competently. But there was no growth, no equity being built, no investment in the next decade. The farm was in a holding pattern that required perfect conditions to sustain and left no room for anything to go wrong. His son had grown up working that farm, had assumed, in the way farm kids do, that it would eventually become his. In 2018, the son took a job in agricultural equipment sales 2 states over, not because he wanted to leave, because he ran his own numbers and saw what was there. That hurt Dale more than the debt. What had actually gone wrong at Hoffner Farm? The question deserves a straight answer because the answer is useful. It wasn't the debt. The debt was real and serious, but it was survivable. Dairy farmers carry heavy debt loads all the time and come out the other side. It wasn't the milk price collapse of 2009. Markets recover. It wasn't even the decision to sell the herd exactly. The real failure was treating a cash flow problem like an asset problem. Dale looked at his situation in 2012 and saw too much debt. So he sold assets to reduce the debt. Logical, reasonable, defensible. But the debt wasn't why the farm was suffering. The farm was suffering because in a low milk price environment, the operating costs of the dairy operation exceeded the revenue it generated. That's a cash flow problem. The solution to a cash flow problem is to fix the cost structure, increase revenue, or weather the cycle. It is not generally to eliminate the revenue stream entirely. When he sold the cows, he didn't solve the cash flow problem. He traded a variable cash flow problem for a seasonal cash flow problem. And the seasonal version turned out to be worse because it left the farm completely exposed to crop price volatility with no buffer. On paper, the farm looked better after the sale. Debt was down. Obligations were lower. The balance sheet had improved. But cash flow, the actual movement of money through an operating year, had become structurally weaker. The farm was more profitable on paper and less viable in practice. That gap between paper and practice is where farms die. Dale Hoffner still farms today. He's in his early 60s. He has 320 acres left, still carries about $430,000 in debt, and runs a crop operation that generates modest but consistent income in average years. He's not losing money. He's not in danger of foreclosure, but the scale of what the farm was and what it might have become is gone. Tom Vickers, who bought the 180 cows in 2012, now runs a 900-cow operation. His crop acres grew. His dairy grew. In the years when crops were weak, dairy carried him. In the years when milk was low, grain covered the gap. He didn't survive by accident. He survived because his operation had structural redundancy built in. 2 income streams that didn't move together. 2 ways to cover costs when one of them stumbled. I asked Dale once if he thought selling the herd was the right decision. He was quiet for a while. "It felt right at the time," he finally said. "The numbers said it was right. I kept saying it was right for 2 years after. And now? Now I think I was solving for the wrong thing. I was trying to reduce what I owed. I should have been trying to protect what I earned. Those aren't the same problem." That's the line that matters. Reducing what you owe and protecting what you earn are not the same problem. In farming, in business, in a lot of places, it's easy to fix one while unknowingly destroying the other. Dale sold 180 cows and watched his debt drop. He watched his weekly cash flow disappear with them. He watched one bad crop year erase 2 years of ground gained. He watched his son leave. He watched the barn stay empty. The barn is still empty. Here's what this story is actually about. It's not about cows or debt or corn prices. It's about diversification as protection, not luxury. Dale Hoffner ran a diverse operation for decades and didn't fully understand what that diversity was doing for him until it was gone. He thought the dairy cows were a cost center in a crisis. They were actually his risk management system. He sold his hedge and called it debt reduction. Tom Vickers understood, maybe instinctively, maybe by design, that the value of two income streams isn't just what each one earns, it's what each one covers for the other. The sum is safer than the parts. Was selling the herd the mistake? Maybe, maybe not. The mistake might have been what came before, running the dairy at a loss through 2009 and 2010 without cutting costs aggressively enough, letting the debt accumulate to a point where the only visible exit was a drastic structural change. The mistake might have been the recovery plan, which was too confident about crop prices that nobody could predict. The mistake might have been not rebuilding even a partial dairy operation in 2015 or 2016, when smaller-scale re-entry might still have been possible. There's rarely one mistake in a farm failure. There's usually a chain of reasonable decisions that made sense individually and became catastrophic in combination. What would you have done with $1? $2 million in debt and a dairy losing money? Think about that seriously. It's not an easy answer. There probably isn't a clean one. If this story made you think differently about cash flow, diversification, and what it means to protect a farm operation, not just on paper but in practice, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Whether they're in agriculture or not, the lesson about confusing debt reduction with financial stability applies a lot wider than dairy farming. And if you've seen this kind of thing happen, a farm, a business, a situation where the right-looking move turned out to be the wrong one for reasons that only became clear later, drop it in the comments. Because the most useful stories aren't the dramatic collapses. They're the quiet ones, the ones where everything looked fine on paper right up until it wasn't. The barn is still empty. The cows are somewhere else, helping someone else build something. And Dale Hoffner farms on, smaller, steadier, and 30 years wiser about the difference between what the numbers say and what the cash flow proves. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.